Hello everybody and welcome to the Atelier tier. We're going to be working on our first project, which is a kind of first term introductory course that you would take coming into the academy on your first day. These are going to be the level of kind of concepts that we're going to be dealing with. It is going to be the Bargue plate of the Psyche of Napoli. The first thing that we notice, right, is actually that this is not really necessarily a naturalistic looking face. We can see even from the simplicity of the nose. I mean, look at the angles on this, right? There's barely an angle break in between them. It's almost like a face that has been, in a sense, simplified. And you could understand then why it's a perfect choice for our first Bargue, because we want to get into maybe something that is not too filled to the brim with detail, because we're focused on things like how do we define and understand and recognize well a shadow shape? How do we get into these little intermediate areas like this and understand how we categorize that and how we create shapes from that observation. I've talked before about the use of an envelope shape, right? An envelope shape is essentially a 2D concept where we are going to focus our attention only on the contours of a subject. But you can see here that there are a lot of spaces actually outside or even much further inside the envelope shape. And I did that, of course, very purposefully, as you will do this very purposefully in your own block-ins. Because you got to understand that at a certain point, it's important for you to extract from your subject what you need, not necessarily just follow what is there. And while this seems like it's not much to say, it's the beginning of a process or beginning of your understanding how to edit the subject that you're seeing in order to suit the stage of the drawing that you're in. The next thing that I want to bring up is the biggest deal in terms of deals that we're dealing with in this project, right? So we're after the understanding of a shadow shape. We've talked a lot about, in a lot of my other courses, about shadow and light, and this is no different, right? But what you're supposed to be kind of taking away from this is a way or a process or a method by which you can recognize a shadow shape. I know that seems like because it's visual, it should be immediately apparent. But in fact, the way that you see a shadow shape today is not going to reflect the way that you see a shadow shape and the way that you define a shadow shape after practicing this method. I don't know for how long, but let's say for several drawings. Every time that you make a drawing with this concept in mind, you're going to deepen your capacity to understand, illustrate, recognize, and use shadow shapes as a tool to aid in your representation of a subject. Chinmay Prakash is saying, so our first step should be to make the envelope shape with a limited number of lines. Exactly. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to go ahead and kind of start out by indicating the kind of top and bottom of the drawing, right? Now, again, it is important that it's kind of done in relationship to your plumb line. So the lowest point on the drawing that I'm making is actually a little bit like further over from this, right? So the lowest point is here. So in fact, you know, when I'm looking at my source image, where that bottom edge kind of crosses the plumb line is actually a little bit further over. It's a little bit further up, a little bit further over. So I'm going to go ahead and just make an indication of that there. All this is here to do is just to give you your kind of first set of proportions, right? Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose roughly a position for the left and right. I'm going to choose that in relationship to basically where the kind of widest aspects, more or less, of the subject are. Now, between the base and the head, we have kind of two widest points, right? We have kind of a widest point out here, and we also have kind of a widest point up here. And the interesting thing kind of about that is that we need to kind of place both of those, right? And you can start out with something really, really approximate. Maybe not worry too much about being perfect at this stage. Again, remember that like in this moment, what we're really trying to do is just to get a very general idea of the subject. Let me just mention briefly, right? So you can see now, and this is the power of a really cool block-in or a really cool envelope shape. You can almost get a sense already that this is recognizably the subject, right? If you look at the Psyche of Napoli and you look at this, or at least this Bargue, and you look at this drawing, you can say that in a way they're quite recognizable. You can almost get a sense actually of the gesture that's kind of running through here, right? So there are these loose adaptations or these loose representations of the subject inside here that are going to help you to kind of recognize what your drawing is kind of all about. I'm going to go ahead and just indicate, you know, the first aspect of shadow that we're going to deal with here. Now, usually, like I would probably wait a little bit longer to indicate the first shadow edge, but I want to also tell you that this is a very fluid process, and if you're doing it right, there's like a lot of different ways that you can interpret this process. Right. So again, you can really see how recognizable it starts to become as we kind of simplify these shapes, create this simple dichotomy. As I said before, like, you know, usually when I'm kind of talking and demoing and stuff, I tend to like measure a little bit less. So I know that I'm going to be slightly less precise as I move through this, but I think I'm going to start kind of adding a few more things to this, just so that, you know, time doesn't drag and that we get some good demonstration out of it. So where we're at in the drawing right now, again, still just kind of making a very complex envelope shape that has basically kind of a third contour. So we have like one contour, we have a second contour, we have kind of a third contour that is the shadow edge that kind of runs through it. And I'm using all these points to kind of compare various heights, like for instance, the edge of the light shape of the cheekbone here turns just basically on my horizontal axis. So I'm just trying to make sure that that kind of lines up with where everything else is lining up on that level. So I'm just noticing a few things as I go that are incorrect, that are inaccurate, and I'm just trying to change those. This is our first best guess as to the proportions and arrangement of kind of the design in this drawing. What we're going to do now is just put in a very basic, relatively uniform value within the shadows. What I want you to notice is actually the speed at which I go through and put my value in, right? So I'm a big believer that with a good sharp pencil, you should be able to actually, just with your pencil, lay in a relatively even value. Notice I'm not doing it like this, where there's these giant gaps in between what I'm drawing. I'm taking my time laterally, right, from left to right, to actually go through and make sure I'm creating a relatively even tone. So it seems like this is pretty even, right? Well, let's do the squint test, right? So I'm going to squint down and look at this, and I'm going to look in the shadow for what I would call kind of aberrant values. So areas where it's too dark or areas where it's too light. Now it might seem like it's relatively even, but with my kneaded eraser, I'm going to pick out a few of the areas which seem to me to be a little bit too dark. Now, this is where you can ask yourselves the question, is Stephen crazy? Like, why is he bothering to do this? Well, I think so much about drawing is about consistency and discipline, which, I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't sound fun. But I would say to you then, I don't think that I necessarily find drawing fun. I find it rewarding. And I think if you're used to any craft, that you'll understand that rewarding and fun are two very different things. And they have very different sensations, and therefore, I think, different practices that take you to that place. I find it rewarding because if I apply myself over time, I come to a result that suits my vision. With your stump also, I want you to be like aware that you don't want to like stump this to death. The reason being is that it's not actually important that this is perfectly smooth and even right now. It's important that at the end of the drawing, it's perfectly smooth and even. And even then, you still don't want it to be like totally flat and like looking like airbrushed, because that's really not at all how your subject looks. It's not really how reality looks. And what I'm going to go through now, I'm going to grab my 0.3 millimeter with a probably B lead in it, and I'm going to go over those shadow edges. I'm just going to push them a little bit harder, get a little bit darker value along that edge, while still maintaining a little bit of a kind of a transitional edge. Like I don't want, listen, like nothing in here should be super sharp. You know, you want to keep a little bit of air in that edge, you know? Right, you notice I didn't just like fill in the value up here and then start kind of working on these edges. I filled in the value everywhere. And ideally what would happen now is if I had all the time in the world, I would actually go through and I'd start to kind of look and observe and go, you know, check my alignments again to make sure things are kind of lining up the way that they should. Like, you know, taking a look, for instance, at, you know, the edge of this shadow here and this. I want to see, do they actually line up in the right way? Am I correct about that? I'm not actually. I'm far from correct. So that means I need to probably push this out a little bit. I think I probably need to bring this in a little bit. So just by kind of like advancing the level a little bit, I need to like go all the way over again. Right? All the things that this is going to sound frustrating, but all the things that I thought were going just fine, now I need to reevaluate. Which again, it's really just part of the plan. Like that's the way it's kind of supposed to work. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to add a little bit more complexity into these shapes. While staying true to the bigger shapes that I've observed, while keeping things very much defined in straight lines. So this is a decent idea of like how you can start to kind of carve out new shapes. I think that's important to kind of talk about because necessarily, you know, you're going to have to get into that territory, that shape complexity. We can only stay like totally simple for so long before we start to need to do this. But what I'm doing basically is I'm separating the values within the shadow into two separate values, right? So what I want to show is a little bit the variation, or essentially the reflected light, which gives the shadows just a little bit of form. But yeah, just to wrap up for everybody, this is, you know, hopefully what your Bargue exercise is going to look like as you kind of push forward with it. Remember, you're just going to keep kind of darkening and unifying your shadows. Try to be subtle in here and try to kind of control your edges. Notice like that in here, my indications are not with sharp edges. Even out here, they are not totally sharp. It's not till we get to like contours like this that you really get realistically quite like sharp edges. And kind of hold back on those maybe for as long as you can, because a hard edge does like lock you into a decision. Hello everybody and welcome to the group critique for the Atelier tier project number 1. We were working on the Psyche of Napoli. I tried to pace out these slides in a way that addresses the different stages that the drawing is going to go through. So the first slides are going to be related to problems that you face maybe in that initial stage, right? And as such, these are going to be problems that are related to proportion, construction, and measurement. So starting out with these two drawings right here, the first thing that we notice about these is the vast difference, not only in the proportion in between the two of them, but also in between both of them as a group and our kind of primary source of inspiration here, the Psyche of Napoli by Charles Bargue. And really, you know, in a way, maybe I say it's like a simple solution. It's not an easy solution, but it basically boils down to where you spent your time and effort. You know, here we have actually in both of them like a really good concept of shadow shape, light shape, right? We kind of see those two groups represented quite clearly. However, that difference in size and difference in kind of construction leaves us with a picture that only has so high a ceiling. Here what we basically needed is more time spent when the drawing actually looked much simpler. I've drawn for you guys a few times kind of the idea of an envelope shape. I'm going to break it down a little bit further here and just say that, that envelope shape is really meant to just represent the idea that you can kind of simplify something, right? That you can take something and bring it down to its kind of base elements. But perhaps in doing so, it also obscures the fact that the envelope shape maybe doesn't need to stop at just the outline of the subject, right? So if we have that same envelope shape concept and we start to connect that together, say like in a situation where we have structural symmetry within the subject, we start to look at that as well, right? And we start to then also look at, a constructive sense of volume inside the subject. We can really start to, like make a lot of effective choices like in that early stage before we get to a place where we're using like value to kind of express the subject. I brought up these two drawings here and here, which I think are really good efforts at kind of getting this bargain into place, but they do share one kind of common problem in between the two, and that is a matter of kind of oversimplification. This is going to sound really challenging because I'm always telling people like from Jump Street, hey, we've got to simplify, right? We can't just take what we have and just like a grid photorealist drawing, go ahead and just render through from quadrant to quadrant. We need to see the big picture, and that means simplification at every stage. Now, when we say oversimplified, what I mean is really quite specific. I don't mean that in a sense that the subject is lacking in some kind of overall view, but rather it's missing certain components. Here, what do we have? We have represented really well the shadow shape, light shape. The part that I find to be a little bit oversimplified comes down here to the edges in between shadow and light. These, of course, I think are two really proficient Bargues. We can see really well that the attention to that kind of unity of shadow is paid really clearly. Probably a little bit more so in this one than in this one. I think we have probably some areas here that are maybe a little bit too light, and I'll point out in a moment just where and why I kind of think that is. But also maybe we have in this one the sense of, like, this would be a good example of what I think is like a good use of values, but probably a little bit too much stump in the application. I brought in these drawings because I think they reflect, in a way, some of the more ideal drawings that kind of came in, and I want to talk about why that is. So much of teaching and so much of self-critique can feel like it should come from a place of criticism, that we say this is wrong, this is not working. But I think, in fact, that we really need to also be affirmative in terms of looking at what is happening, what is working, and why that's working. In fact, these are really valuable things because those are the things that you want to take out and carry forward into your next drawing. Let's look at an area like this. We can see, again, just pointing out, these commonalities. Here we see really clearly those angle breaks. This one's really interesting too because it's a little bit softer, a little bit of a different technical application, but we really still find that same idea present, that we sense an analytical draftsperson looking at angle breaks, but also keeping them kind of soft enough. So really, really good job in doing that task that, though is simple to describe, is very maybe challenging to kind of keep all in your head at the same time. Another place that I wanted to point out was this, in the sense that this artist here has focused on creating the kind of gradient or kind of boundary in between shadow light, or between shadow and light, that is commensurate with its kind of the definition of the form that it's passing over, but not really obsessed over how to create the smoothest transition that you can create. We have clear hatch marks here. However, when we squint down and we look at this subject in front of us here, and we look at our subject over here, we find a very similar impression in between the two. There's no kind of broken transitions here. And that's going to be it for the group critique. I really enjoyed the questions you all had. I hope that you got a lot out of the experience. I want you to take your drawings out. I want you to look at them and ask questions of them, right? Look at your edge hierarchy. Look at your value hierarchy. Look at the block in and basically what kind of big angles you left behind and whether you feel confident about those still. Get a fresh eye and just kind of reassess. Whether or not it means that you work on that drawing a little bit more, that you push yourself a little bit further, to me, it doesn't matter. You've gone through the process, you've worked on shadow shapes, you've moved through the stages, you've extracted something from this experience. Whether or not your drawing at the end is perfect, it would be great if it was. It's also great that it's not. it's a learning process that you're going through, and the fact that you've kind of manifested a drawing out of it, I think is the important part.